Tom, welcome to the John and Ken Show.
Well, thanks, guys.
There's so much propaganda about warming temperatures. Talk about the forest mismanagement and why that has so much to do with the extent of these fires.
Well, it's not complicated, and anybody who thinks that if we all ride our bikes to work, this problem's going away is simply delusional. Look, excess timber comes out of the forest in one of two ways. It's either carried out or it burns out. We used to carry it out. It was called logging. We had healthy forests and we had a thriving economy. And then in the 1970s, we began imposing environmental laws that have made it all but impossible to carry out that timber. And what we've seen over those decades, increasingly severe forest fires. We've had an 80% decline in timber harvested out of our federal forests since 1980, and we've had a concomitant increase in acreage destroyed by fire. And the mismanagement has gotten to the point where you can now tell the boundary between private lands that are not affected by these laws and the public lands that are. And you can tell them solely by looking at the condition of the forest. You can actually tell the boundary line by the condition of the forest on each side. Now, how clever of the climate only to decimate the public lands.
Talk about what happens when you simply have too many trees growing in a forest too close together. What's the effects?
Well, an untended forest is just like an untended garden. It's going to grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. And that's what's happened in the Sierra Nevada. Instead of harvesting the excess timber, we've allowed it to accumulate to the point where we now have 4 times the timber density that the land can support. Well, like any environment where you have overcrowding, that causes stress, and that stress then makes the trees vulnerable to disease, to pestilence like bark beetles, to drought, and ultimately it's consumed by catastrophic wildfire. That's how nature manages a forest. It's been doing so for many, many millennia. In the 20th century, we decided, we don't want to wait 200 or 300 years for a forest to go through that cycle. We want to preserve these forests so that every generation can afford them. That's why we started the Forest Service, and it began active scientific management. It matched the tree density to the ability of the land to support it, and we had healthy forests all that time. And by the way, we used to make money doing that. We would, foresters every year would go into the forest, they would mark off the surplus timber, that timber would be put out to bid, logging companies would then pay us to take that excess timber out. 25% of that went into the local communities in the mountains. The other 75% went into the Forest Service that we could invest back into our national forest system. These environmental laws have now turned things around to the point where we cannot make any money doing it. The cost of the reports, 4 years is typical for a NEPA report to do a forest thinning project. The report itself is 800 pages or more, so not a lot of that gets done. And when we do it, it ends up costing us money because what we can get for the trees doesn't cover the cost of the environmental studies.
So, this is really about not only just save the trees, even the dead trees. The LA Times has a story today that there's 150 million dead trees in the Sierra Nevada.
Well, it used to be
says you've got to remove that before it burns.
Well, not only that, but a fire-killed tree has a lot of value. You can actually cut those things down, mill them. There's enormous value, and we used to do that. We used to auction, when a forest came through and killed trees, we would then auction off those trees for salvage, and we would get money for that. Well, now the expedited environmental impact studies for a salvage operation require 2 years. Well, here's the problem. Over those 2 years, the trees lose all of their value. So by the time you finish that evaluation process, the timber's not worth anything. You put it out to bid, nobody wants to bid on it. So it stays there in the federal forests. It doesn't regrow. Brush gets first claim on forest-damaged land. So after a couple of years, what you've got left is about 4 to 6 feet of dry brush, and then these dead, dry tree stumps, or tree trunks, I should say, across the landscape. they start falling on top of the brush, and you've got a perfect fire stack for a second-generation fire, and we're seeing some of that here in this region.
So it seems like a lot of people in federal government, it even sounds like Gavin Newsom realizes the last 40 years have been bad policy. Is that what you're hearing? Are people coming around to saying, we used to do this right, we're going to go back to it?
We're seeing more and more of that. Here's the problem, though. Until we reform those environmental laws like NEPA and the ESA, we cannot restore the forests to their former vitality because it's simply cost prohibitive and endlessly time consuming. Now, here's what we did do in the Tahoe Basin. We got a measure through back in 2016 that gives a categorical exclusion from NEPA for forest thinning operations up to a certain amount, and you can do as many of them as you want. Well, what that has done is taken the environmental reports from 800 pages down to a dozen pages. It's taken the environmental review process from 4 years down to just a few months. The Forest Service is now using it for the biggest forest thinning project ever attempted in the Tahoe Basin, and they need it desperately. It's very vastly overgrown. 60,000 acres with 20,000 acres of mechanical thinning that is directly drawing from this new legal authority. Here's the problem. That was my bill. In order to get that through the Senate and get it in the WIN Act, we had to agree to limit it to the Tahoe Basin. So it's working in the Tahoe Basin. We need to extend those same policies across the entire Forest Service system, and I have a bill to do so, and yet we can't get a hearing in the Natural Resources Committee under Nancy Pelosi.
You know what's crazy? It's what you said at the very beginning. If we don't thin the forest ourselves, nature will with a massive fire, which is what's going on now.
Yeah, exactly. And as you can see, nature is a lousy gardener.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's only two ways to take care of this. We either carry the trees out or they get burned out.
And to call this a modern problem is ludicrous. Before Western civilization, we lost even more wildlands to fire every year, 4 to 12 million acres a year in California, according to paleontologists who studied this thing. We got that down to 250,000 acres with the Forest Service in the 1980s, in the entire last half of the 20th century.
We got to go.
And now we're back up.
That's what fries me. That's what fries me about all the propaganda. They talk about, oh, my God, the worst fire season ever. Oh, the climate change has created such a monstrous situation. You're talking about 250,000 acres burning compared to 4 to 12 million acres back before human beings found California to live in.
But now we're back up to 3 million acres this year alone. Why? Because we abandoned active forest management for the environmental left. And after 45 years of these laws in place, all of which were imposed with the promise they were going to improve our forest environment, I think we're entitled to ask, well, fine, how's the forest environment doing? And the answer is absolutely damning. And to attribute this to global warming is simply to ignore all of the history of forest management for generations.
All right, Tom.
All right, Tom. Yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tom, welcome to the John and Ken Show.
Well, thanks, guys.